Welcome to the Pluralist Points podcast. And today we are joined by Professor Josiah Ober. He's a professor of political science and classics at Stanford University. He focuses on historical institutionalism and political theory. In his research, he also explores the political thought and practice of the ancient Greek world and its contemporary relevance. He has published numerous articles and authored a number of books, including Mass and Elite in Democracy Athens, Political Dissent in Democratic Athens, Democracy and Knowledge, Demopolis, Democracy Before Liberalism in Theory and Practice. Now, he recently co-authored The Civic Bargain, How Democracy Survives with Brooke Manville, which is the subject of our conversation today. Thank you, Professor Ober, for joining us.
Thank you, Ben. Great to be here.
Right. Now, as I was reading your book, I was thinking that, you decided to take a positive perspective and look at why and how certain democracies endured, not only why and how they failed. So I was curious, why did you take this approach? Is it because you're naturally an optimist?
No, thank you. And by the way, you should call me Josh. That's what my students all call me. So that's where I'm comfortable. So yes, Brooke Manville, my co-author, and I decided that there was an awful lot of work that's being done that we thought was really good work and important work about threats to democracy, about why democracies die, how they get in profound trouble. And we worried that, in a sense, this was leaving out the essential question, which is the other side of the issue, is when democracies don't die, when they survive for a long time, how is it that they do that? So it's a part of the, I think, question of how do you think about democracy in a time when you're worried about the future, is both what can go wrong, but also what is the historical evidence for things having gone right, at least for a very long time. So yes, I think we are probably optimists by nature. Figure that if you're excessively pessimistic, then you're not going to do the things that might, in fact, allow a crisis to be overcome, indeed maybe a crisis even to be turned to an opportunity. But we're trying to avoid in the book a kind of blind optimism that says, don't worry, everything's fine. Indeed, we really motivate the book by saying that if you don't do the right things, if you don't get the right conditions, then indeed democracy is likely to be in trouble.
Now, as a scholar who looks at democracies from a historical context, how do democracies arise? How do they emerge? How do they form?
So our basic idea in the book, or the idea we start with anyway, is that democracy should be defined as no boss, or at least no boss other than one another. So the impulse towards democracy is the resistance to having some external power, a king, an oligarchy, tell you what to do. And we then suggest that the real only alternative to being told what to do by some ultimate boss is to figure out how to organize the political sphere, organize what we are going to do together ourselves. And so that really is the beginning of democracy, is a bunch of people somewhere saying, we've had enough of being bossed around, and we won't have it anymore. This can be an evolutionary process in which people to become increasingly fed up and to do things that slowly move the boss into a more and more minor position. That's sort of the theory, or at least one way of explaining what happens in the United Kingdom. Or you can have a revolution that just kicks the tyrant out, and then you've got to figure out what to do in the in the aftermath. That's what happens, for example, at Athens or at Rome. Or you can have, as the case in the United States, you become fed up with an external boss that you feel is not doing what the boss was supposed to do in terms of providing you with basic liberties, and then you say, we're done. We're not going to be ruled by the king any longer, and we're going to run things ourselves. But I think it's always this conception that we don't want somebody telling us what to do who isn't us.
Right, right, right. Now, when you look around and you observe the situation with democracies across the board, what problem are you seeing? What issues are you seeing? Obviously, there's quite a bit written about in terms of, the democratic backsliding is what oftentimes people refer to. But what are some of the core problems that led you to say, hey, we need to write something to get people to understand what this democratic project is all about?
Yeah. So our core idea in the book is that democracy really is a bargain. It's got to be a bargain that is made within a pluralistic society. So we assume that the people who decide we don't want a boss are not just a homogenous mass of people who agree on everything else. Yeah, they agree we don't want a boss, but they don't necessarily agree on what the marginal tax rate should be once we have to, raise some funds to deal with, for example, foreign policy, national security, and so on. And so we say that it is imperative to recognize that not having a boss means that you have to learn to negotiate with your fellow citizens over matters on which you disagree. And we can try to limit the degree of disagreement. We can try to make arguments to each other and say, it would be better to have the marginal tax rate as this. Don't you see how right I am? But at a certain point, you're going to say, no, actually, I don't agree. And then we're going to have some method to say, all right, we're going to come to the best deal we can. And the whole purpose of basically making these deals is to be able to go on together without a boss, running our own affairs as best we can. And so we want to say that as soon as the idea of negotiating with, bargaining with, coming to the best agreement you can find with your fellow citizens is rejected, when that's rejected, and we say, I don't want to make a negotiation with them. I want to force them to do things my way. And I reject the idea that those people really are even my fellow citizens. If they don't believe what I believe. So that kind of strong polarization, value polarization, is what we really see as a big threat to democracy, because it makes people convinced that democracy is about getting pure justice or getting exactly what you think is the right way, as opposed to recognize that democracy is always an imperfect bargain, imperfect from the point of view of any individual or any individual group's idea of what would be absolutely best. No one's going to get what they think is best because we're in a pluralistic society in which people's interests are not identical. So that's our key thing, is to try to say that democracy really is about compromise. It has to be. And because it's about compromise, it will always be, the solutions will always be imperfect from everybody's point of view. That's just intrinsic to the system. And as soon as you start demanding perfection, you're basically rejecting the very idea of democracy.
Yeah, interesting. Now, how much of having a democracy or creating the conditions of a grand bargain is fairly thin? Because I'm thinking about ways in which, we tend to be very naturally inclined towards bossing each other around.
Mhm.
And so what we have, in democracies are sort of unnatural. It's kind of in some ways a bit antithetical to our human nature. Is that your sense?
I'll push back on that, Ben, because I think that if you look at human societies, as it were, in the state of nature, you look at foraging societies before agriculture. To the extent to which these can be studied by anthropologists, it suggests that these early societies are actually quite democratic. They don't have an absolute boss. And so it suggests at least that living in a community without a boss is naturally possible for human beings because human beings have done that and apparently did do that for hundreds, probably, well, it depends on how long you think modern humans have been around, but for a very long time before the emergence of agriculture. Now, when you begin to develop things like agriculture, requiring irrigation in some areas, there are real advantages that come with hierarchy. And some of the advantages with hierarchy lead to the creation of these sort of very boss-led societies. So that's another possibility. We're quite able to live in that, and obviously many human societies have been, highly hierarchical with a king at the top and a hierarchy of people all the way down to sort of laborers at the bottom. But that's not our only option as human beings. One of the things that history shows us is that there really is, at various periods of history, a tendency to say, we don't want a boss, we want to run things ourselves. So we see this, for example, in the classical Greek period, with the emergence of democracy in Athens, see it again in Rome, with the emergence of the Roman Republic. And I think we see it in early English history with the pushback, at least initially by nobles, but then more broadly against the kind of absolutism of the king, the resistance to the idea that the king is the ultimate boss. And of course, in the United States, or in what becomes the United States, there's a very strong conception that we don't want to be run by an external power, by a boss, and that we can create this new form of government. And the question then is, how can we do that in modernity at scale? So how can we scale up the kinds of attitudes, I think, or the kind of behaviors that allowed, early foraging societies in just a few dozen people, or ancient Athens with some tens of thousands of people, or then hundreds of thousands of people when you get out to Rome, but now tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people. Scale is really hard. It's harder and harder to run ourselves. And that's why we keep on needing to devise new kinds of institutional technologies. And you can think of federalism, as an institutional technology that allows you to scale up democratic processes without ultimately turning over power to, a single leader.
Yeah. That's actually a great segue because I was going to ask you about the question of scaling and growing as a society, emerges over time. They grow in population, they grow in diversity. How we address it is through institutional innovation, and it's interesting. You mentioned technology, and you highlight, federalism as a kind of a technology that is developed to accommodate this kind of growing. That's really, really interesting. Now, you outline the 7 conditions that allow for a democracy to be sustained within this grand civic bargain. And you talk about some of the things that are the um, technology parts, the innovation parts of democracy, right? The citizen-led institutions, or we talk about legislature and executive and judiciary and so on and so forth. But then there are also these informal, norms and so on. You talk about civic friendship and civic education and all these things.
Mhm.
Where do you rank the sort of order of importance, if you can at all, if it even makes sense to do that? Would you put the informal norms ahead of the technology, or vice versa?
Yeah, that's a great question. And obviously there's feedback loops here. That in a sense, when you develop a new technology, you develop the ideas of federalism, then you have to learn how to use that. And in learning how to use it, you end up that, well, the theory didn't necessarily work exactly as the inventors thought. And so you move back and forth between, in a sense, the informal and the formal. But the way we really see it, and we end up in the book saying that what does democracy really rest on in the end? And we claim that it really rests on what is the 7th of our basic conditions, and that's civic education. What we really say is if we're not able to educate one another as citizens in the basic duties and responsibilities of citizenship, and if we're not able to educate the next generation in the question of, well, why is democracy worth doing? It's kind of expensive. It asks you for some real time and energy. It asks you to do things in order to govern ourselves that we could just outsource to a boss and have more time to just do whatever it is we want to do in our free time. So I think we've got to, if you want to, do you think democracy is a good thing? If you think that there are problems with authoritarian forms of government,
Mhm.
then I think it's imperative for us to educate ourselves and next generations in both how do we do that? What does it take to do that? What are the skills? What's the knowledge that is necessary to really be an effective citizen? And then in the values of what do you get? What's in the package? Why is freedom a good thing? Why is it better to be an equal citizen than the subject of, a superior group that will tell you what to do on a daily basis? And I think that, the sense that that is something worthwhile may be fairly widespread, but I think we really need to make that argument rather than just assume everybody just would figure it out on their own.
Yeah. On civic education, where do you think we are now in America? How would you evaluate the way that we've done civic education so far?
I I would not give ourselves currently a very high grade, I will say. I think that there certainly was a recognition for a long time in the country that civic education really is imperative. We can look back to the founding era, the constitutional era, and all of these writing, which becomes collected as the Federalist Papers, and then the anti-Federalist arguments about the ratification of the Constitution. And what were they doing? They were writing op-eds in newspapers seeking to educate their fellow citizens about why this new Constitution was a good thing, despite all of its imperfections, which, were recognized as imperfections at the time. And then others, the anti-federalists, saying why they think it's not a good thing, why it would be better to go back to the Articles of Confederation, which were the early form of organization in the United States. So right from the beginning, there's this idea that it is imperative that we educate one another, and we've got to do it through reasoned arguments. In the 20th century, or the early 20th century, there was a big move for civic education because it was recognized that with large-scale immigration, we're going to have to bring a lot of people who don't have a background in how to do this, how to be citizens. And so, for example, I teach at Stanford University, looked into the history of this, and Stanford had in 1920 a course that was called Problems of Citizenship. Hired every Stanford first-year student to take a year-long course in thinking about why freedom and political organization or collective action are hard to do at the same time. It's really a good course from everything we've been able to determine from it. But obviously we can't just reproduce that course. But once again, at Stanford, we recently introduced a new first-year course. It was taken by 1,200 first-year students this year, called Citizenship in the 21st Century, because we thought it was imperative to begin doing this again. There'd been a long time in which there was nothing like this taught at Stanford or any other American university that we know of anyway. And we think we really need to start doing that. Now, obviously, universities aren't the only place we should be doing this. We need to think about doing, a civic education at the K-12 level, at the community college level. We need to think about how we educate citizens, citizen to citizen. Can't only be happening in schools. Do I think, there is really a sense that I get, maybe the people I talk with, other optimists, to say that we got to do this, that we can do it. And there really is, in a sense, a crisis in that civic education was allowed to lapse, but it's something we can bring back, and we really ought to bring back. So in my optimistic modes, I talk with people. I talk with people on the red states and blue states, conservatives and progressives, and pretty much everyone agrees, actually, this civic education thing is important. Now, the content of it's going to be different, depending on where you are, then that's okay. But I think the core idea that we really have to begin educating for being free citizens of a democratic country, if we want to continue to be that, is really imperative. So I'm hopeful sometimes anyway. Want to be kind of a renewed recognition that this is the foundation, and then you build up from that to a recognition of why these institutions are important.
Now, civic friendship, which is the sixth condition out of the seven for sustaining a democracy, is interesting. In the book, you say it's regarding one another as sharers in a common enterprise. And in that context, you talk about civic dignity as well, and the kind of respect and recognition that each of us accords those we regard as our moral equals. Can you elaborate on that idea?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the core question of how it is that you're able to go into to a bargaining position with your fellow citizens, or the people you elect or as representatives who are going to make a bargain. You're going to basically make the rules that we're going to live by, that are going to be compromised, are going to be based rather on compromise. We've got to have this sense that we're not enemies, aiming at some kind of a victory, in the way that, if this was a war that we were fighting, we would be trying to defeat our enemy and impose upon them the rules that we, the victors, would have. It's not a football game in which one side wins and one side loses. Football is a great sport, but politics can't be seen in that kind of way. I think we've got to recognize that we're engaged in this, not necessarily with friends who are the sort of people who, want to go out and, have a cup of coffee with each other and, talk about their families or whatever it is. It's not that kind of friendship, but it is exactly what you said, Ben. It's a recognition that we're in a common enterprise together, that we need one another, that we need to recognize that we are in this thing together. And in order to make it work, we must accord each other the kind of basic respect that civic friends give one another. That is, I see you as my moral equal. When you make an argument to me, I'm going to listen to it. Might not be convinced by it, but I'm going to attend to it. I'm going to try to understand where you're coming from. I'm not going to treat you as a child and say, "Oh yes, well that's what a cute little thing to say." That's fundamentally disrespectful. That's not what how civic friends treat one another. And so I think, once again, in our book, we worry that there's a decline in this recognition that we must be friends rather than enemies. We must be in a common enterprise, not in, as it were, a war with one another. And without that kind of recognition, it's going to be increasingly impossible to make the kind of hard decisions, the bargains that mean that, there's stuff that you don't get. And if you see it as a war, you think, well, the enemy just won because they got something they wanted, and I didn't get everything I wanted. So that's the idea of, civic education, teaching people what it is to be in an enterprise together, to be civic friends, is once again something that we see as absolutely imperative.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Now, going back to the scaling question, when a democracy scales, in each of these examples that you provide, whether it's ancient Greece or it's Rome, or it's the British parliamentarism, or the American Constitution, how did they deal with the scaling challenge versus how we're dealing with it right now?
Yeah. So scale really is the big challenge. Throughout the book, we keep on returning to it. It's also the great opportunity, because a challenge, because the more people you have in, as it were, a bargaining situation, and the more diverse they are in their interests and their experience and their background and their values, the more challenging it's going to be to get a common agreement. On the other hand, the more different kinds of experience and knowledge and know-how that you have to bring into a solution space, the more innovative, the more successful potentially that solution is going to be. This is, I think, traditionally one of the problems that autocrats have, is that they live in basically information and knowledge and experience bubbles. They're surrounded by yes men who will say, well, fearless leader, of course, whatever you think and believe must be correct. And they specifically will try to resist bringing in a perspective from outside that which is, in the immediate interest of the ruling group. Whereas democracies, I think, traditionally have done really well by bringing in diverse perspectives, diverse kinds of knowledge, know-how, skills, and bringing them to trying to solve the problems that we need to solve. How are we going to, win the Second World War? Well, once again, you think about the diversity of skills that were brought to that problem, and the ways in which that meant that a free society was able to defeat the highly efficient hierarchical, society. Think about why, in the end, the United States did better than the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Well, once again, I think it's because we were able to leverage our pluralism, our diversity, and make that into a strength. It can be that diversity and scale is a real advantage, but you've got to figure out how to do it. You've got to figure out how to meet that challenge of getting that bargain, getting that agreement among an increasingly diverse group of people. And we can see that it really is a challenge historically. So in some ways, ancient Athens is ultimately defeated by first the Macedonians and then the Romans because they weren't able to scale up. They just wanted to keep a cohesive citizen group. Initially, it was bold. They expanded out citizenship to people who were not elite, who weren't rich, who were workers, laborers, day laborers. So that was a really bold thing. But then they stopped, they weren't able to figure out how could we include women? How could we include people who are who choose to move here from other states? Never figured out how to do that, and in the end, they just didn't have enough people. They didn't have either the numbers or the diversity that they needed to deal with the challenge. The Romans do it differently. The Romans figure out that you can scale up citizenship pretty radically, but then they did hugely well because of that. They create this empire. But it turns out that citizenship can be really thinned down, so that by the time they've created this massive, radically expanded citizenship across much of well, certainly all of Italy and other parts of the Mediterranean, it turns out that each individual citizen doesn't really feel very connected to the political process anymore. And they don't really feel that what their choice is, or that they are being respected. And so they then turn to leaders who say, I'll give you, real advantages if you follow me. And that leads to civil war and ultimately the collapse of the republic. So scale really is a big challenge. And I think, in many ways, we're facing a big scale challenge today. Trying to think about how can we bring very diverse society onto or into a space in which we can still make decisions together. We can still bargain together. And the worry is that people will see themselves as so different from one another. My group is just so different from yours that there's no way we can be in a bargaining situation. You all want crazy things, and we can't accept that. And at that point, the whole thing begins to fall apart. So, the scale challenge really is one that, and I think we have to address. And once again, it goes back to civic education. We have to recognize that it is a challenge.
Yeah.
That it is hard. It's not just naturally going to happen. We've got to think about how to address it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you. Now, can you share from your insights in research and, looking at all these four examples, classical Athens, Republican Rome, British parliamentarianism, and U.S. constitutionalism, um, uh, research and insights that can help, uh, you know, inform some of our current challenges with respect to issues like populism and polarization.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that we can because we see that in each of the cases we studied, although Athens, Rome didn't last forever. They lasted for a long time. And they were democratic for a long time. And they survived a lot of really serious crises. And how did they do that? And in each case, what we say that if you sort of build up from the bottom, they figured out a way to educate citizens at increasing scale in various ways through stories that were told commonly to everybody. Everyone knew the stories of various heroes of the past or sacrifices that were made in the past by groups or by individuals. They figured out ways then in which they could emphasize what is shared among the citizens, therefore to friendship rather than enmity. And they innovated in new institutions, creating new forms of institutional organization that allowed them to address these problems. So, institutions do matter. We need the informal, we need the education, we need civic friendship. But then, we really have to figure out, how are we going to make decisions? How do you get thousands of people into a decision-making place, and ultimately come up with a decision that is our decision. And these take, in each case, real, I think it's fair to say a kind of organizational genius to break through to seeing that, no, there's new ways to do it. There's new ways to mix people together. There's new ways to use, as it were, the power of rhetoric, of public speaking, without being captured by the kind of populists who will use rhetoric in a vicious way. So, you can study this in Athens, in Greece, and in Rome, in the UK, in the US. There really were institutional solutions being devised to problems. And we need to continue to do that. There's a sort of sense that, well, our Constitution is what we've got, and that's it. Yes, the constitutional frame is really an important one. It's a powerful one, but we can't just rest on our laurels. We've got to really think about, how are we going to, continue to revise our institutional framework in a way that will allow us to address the problems of the 21st century. And there are all kinds of new and exciting challenges and
Yeah.
opportunities, but we're going to have to keep on evolving our institutional framework as we keep on, rebuilding, the
Mhm.
background forms that allow that institutional framework to function.
Great. Now, towards the end of the book, you highlight three items for basically saving democracy. And, you say we have to learn about democracy's nature, fundamental conditions, and historical developments. We have to support and promote, the development of expanded civic education. And we have to summon the courage to act now. What do you mean by that?
Yes. So I think one of the things that people become frustrated about is they think, well, what can I do? You
Mhm.
know,
Yeah.
Washington's a mess. I'm just one person and so on.
Mhm.
Uh, and what we suggest is that each of us can do things. We're each members of communities of various sorts, geographic communities, neighborhoods, towns. We are members of various virtual communities. We are members of work communities. And what we ought to do is to ask each of ourselves, how can I promote the mutual, education of citizens by citizens, promote the idea that we need to have civil discourse, we need to be able to talk with each other. One of the things is just summoning up the courage to talk with somebody that you don't agree with, and try to create the space to listen to what they're saying without just blowing your stack. And you can do that informally. This can be done in city councils, all kinds of, there are various formal institutions in which this can be done. But basically what we say is that each of us has spaces in which we can begin to at the base, at mutual education, and trying to recognize that civil discourse is possible, that negotiation is not impossible. You can understand from one another, what is the thing that really is most important to you that you just can't give up. And you understand that from me. And, we then start to say, well, okay, where might we be able to come up with some agreements that would allow us to go forward? But I think we've got to start doing this locally. Now, and then support things all the way up. Support candidates for office, left, right, but who are saying, we're in this together, rather than those who say, the enemy must be destroyed. Blame people for using the rhetoric of enemy rather than the rhetoric of friend. Saying that that's actually destructive of what we're trying to do together as a democracy. I think we can each do that right now, and if we begin doing that right now, it builds back towards the notion of, yes, we are in something together and we can make compromises and we can rebuild and recommit to the deep civic bargain that is a democratic society.
Mhm, mhm. That's great. Now, I was going to ask you, what's your call to action? And I think this sort of, the idea that you have to summon the courage to act now, seems to me a great call to action as we wrap up. But one thing I also wanted to bring up is the idea of, compromise, which you mentioned as one of the key conditions that's important for sustaining a democracy. And in the era where compromise has become a really bad word, what can we do there? I recently heard someone talk about using the term accommodation instead of compromise. That
Yeah.
seems to get some buy-in from folks on the other side. So there maybe there are ways around it.
I hope so. I mean, it's why we emphasize this term bargain, the civic bargain, because I think everybody kind of understands what it is to be
Mhm.
engaged in a bargaining situation,
Right.
right? You're going to buy a used car. The used car salesman might want all your money and not give you the car. That would be Total win for him. You might want the car and not give any money. Total win for you. That's not going to happen. You're going to engage in some kind of a bargain in which neither of you gets everything you want,
Mhm.
but you'll both be better off
Mhm.
inside the bargain than
Yeah.
outside the bargain, at least if you cut the deal. And so that's why I want to think that bargaining is something that we imagine is something that people understand. I don't think it has a negative, a strongly negative sense. And if we think that a civic bargain is just the same kind of bargain we strike all the time when we buy and sell stuff, it is give you a way to think about, yeah, maybe we need to do that when we're creating our lives together as
Mhm.
citizens as well.
Yeah. Well, Josh, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been a very, very insightful conversation. The book is Civic Bargain, How Democracy Survives. And I encourage folks to get a copy. Thank you, Josh. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Been a great conversation. Much enjoyed it.